The bread was what gave her away. Not her face, which was ordinary enough that a man could look straight at it and forget it before he'd turned his head. Not her dress, which was the color of old dishwater and had been mended so many times the patches had patches. Not even the way she moved through the crowded dining hall of the Clearwater station house. Quick and careful, the way small animals move when they've learned that drawing attention to themselves costs more than it's worth. It was the bread. Isobel Crane had been setting tables at the Clearwater station house for 3 weeks before anyone asked her name. She'd arrived on the Thursday mail coach from Lethbridge with a carpetbag that held everything she owned in the world and a letter of introduction from Reverend Morley that described her as reliable, quiet, and without encumbrance. Which was another way of saying she was 24 years old with no family, no prospects, and no particular reason to be anyplace else. Mrs. Drummond, who ran the station house with the cheerful efficiency of a woman who'd long since stopped expecting gratitude, had looked her over the way a farmer looks over a new piece of land, not unkindly, but with an eye toward what it might yield. "You cook?" Mrs. Drummond had asked. "Yes, ma'am." "You bake?" "Yes, ma'am." "You complain?" Isobel had looked at the woman steadily. "No, ma'am." Mrs. Drummond had handed her an apron. The Clearwater station house sat at the junction of 2 cattle roads in southern Alberta, 40 miles from the nearest town of any consequence, and approximately that many miles from anywhere a young woman alone might reasonably want to be. It served as a waystation, a dining hall, a rough sort of hotel, and in the evenings a place where men sat and drank coffee and talked about cattle prices and the weather, because there was nothing else to talk about, and it needed talking about regardless. The men who passed through were ranchers, drovers, the occasional traveling merchant, and now and then a government man who looked slightly frightened by everything and ate his meal without speaking to anyone. They were not cruel men, most of them. They simply did not see her. She was the hands that set down the plate and removed it again. She was the sound of the kitchen door. She was the bread, and the bread, that was the thing. Isobel Crane made bread the way some people breathed, without thinking about it, without effort, the body doing what the body knew. She'd learned from her mother in the yellow kitchen of a farmhouse outside Red Deer. The two of them standing side by side on winter mornings, with flour on their arms to the elbow, and she had kept making it long after the farmhouse was sold, and her mother was in the ground, and there was no yellow kitchen anymore. It was the one thing she had carried through the years that had not changed shape on her. The bread at Clearwater was nothing fancy. Brown loaves, mostly, sometimes white, when the supply wagon came through with good flour. She made it every morning before anyone else was awake, in the gray hour before dawn, when the kitchen belonged to her, and the only sound was the fire and the slow breath of the sleeping house. She did not make it for anyone in particular. She made it because it was Tuesday, or because it was cold, or because her hands needed something to do that was not thinking. Nobody ever said anything about it, which was fine. She was not making it for compliments. Callum Holt arrived on a Wednesday in late October, riding in ahead of a weather system that turned the sky the color of bruised iron. Isobel first noticed him the way she noticed most things, peripherally, while doing something else. She was carrying a tray of supper things from the back table when the door opened and the wind came in with him, scattering napkins and making the lamp flames lean sideways. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that had seen better decades. His face was the particular weathered brown of a man who'd spent most of his years outdoors, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting at the horizon and possibly from something else beside. He was perhaps 40, perhaps older. It was difficult to say. Some men wore their age the way they wore a well-broken saddle, just part of them, fitted to the shape they'd become. He sat at the far end of the long table and removed his hat and set it beside his plate and looked at nothing in particular while he waited. He did not talk to the men around him, though a couple tried. He was not unfriendly. He just seemed as though he was somewhere slightly removed from the room, thinking about something that had nothing to do with any of them. Isobel brought him his plate, stew and bread, same as everyone else. And he said, "Thank you," and went back to not being there. She thought nothing more of him. He was still there at breakfast. He ate alone at the end of the table again. He drank 3 cups of coffee. He read something. She noticed he'd pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and was studying it with the furrowed concentration of a man who did not find reading easy. His lips moved slightly. He folded the paper away before anyone could see what it was. When Isobel set down his bread, 2 slices, buttered already, the way she did for everyone, he reached out and stopped her without touching her, just a small movement of his hand, not quite reaching. "Ma'am." She stopped. He was looking at the bread, not at her. "You make this?" She said yes. She said it the way she said most things. Plainly, without decoration, waiting to find out what was wrong with it. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "It's good bread." And that was all. Isobel went back to the kitchen. She stood at the work table and looked at her hands for a moment, which she did not usually do. Then she went back to work. He stayed 4 days, which was longer than most travelers. Mrs. Drummond mentioned it to Isobel the second afternoon. In the distracted way, she mentioned most things while doing 3 other things. "That Mr. Holt," she said, turning the page of her account book. "He's asked about staying on a few extra days. Says the weather." "Is it the weather?" Isobel asked, because the sky had cleared the previous afternoon and the sun was out. Mrs. Drummond's expression suggested she had noticed this. "I expect he has his reasons," she said, which was her way of closing a topic. Isobel watched him. In the careful sideways way she watched most things. Not because she was particularly interested. Because watching was a habit she'd developed in the years since. She'd learned that missing small things could sometimes cost you considerably. She watched the way he moved, deliberate, unhurried, the way of a man who'd spent time with animals and knew that sudden movements startled them. She watched the way he listened to conversations he wasn't part of, head slightly tilted. She watched him outside one afternoon when he'd gone to look at the fence line along the east pasture without being asked, and stood there examining it for a long time before walking away. She did not know what to make of him. On the 3rd day, he found her in the kitchen, not intruding. He'd stopped at the open doorway and knocked on the door frame. The way a careful man knocks on a door that's already open, just to be proper about it. She was rolling dough and she didn't startle, though she came close. "Mr. Holt, Miss Crane." He'd learned her name then. She was mildly surprised. "I apologize for the interruption. I wanted to ask if there was anything needed fetching. I'm going out toward the dry goods store," and Mrs. Drummond said. He stopped, looked at his hat in his hands. "She said to ask you." There was a list on the side table. Isobel wiped her hands and handed it to him. He looked at it. The same careful, effortful look he'd given the paper at breakfast. And then she understood, in the quiet, unceremonious way that useful information sometimes arrives. He was not reading slowly because he was slow. He was reading slowly because reading was a skill he'd come to late or poorly, and he was doing it as correctly as he could manage without anyone seeing him struggle. She said, quite normally, "The most important things are the salt and the cream of tartar. The rest can wait if they're out." He looked up. Something moved in his face. A small thing, barely there. Salt and cream of tartar, he said. Yes, sir. He folded the list into his coat pocket. I'll be sure of those two, he said, and left. She went back to her dough. She did not say anything to Mrs. Drummond. She did not say anything to anyone. It was not her information to share. She had been the recipient of enough other people's careful, well-meaning confidences about her own private matters to know that keeping a thing to yourself was sometimes the most decent gift you could give a person. He came back with the salt and the cream of tartar and everything else on the list, which suggested he'd had assistance from the storekeeper without having had to ask for it openly. She unpacked the supplies without comment and said, "Thank you." He said, "You're welcome." He left. That was the shape of the days. He left on a Friday morning, and she found herself noticing his absence at breakfast, the way you notice a draft that's stopped. Not immediately, but after a moment, the room feeling slightly different in texture. She thought that was that. She was wrong. He came back 6 weeks later, in December, when the first real cold had settled into the ground, and staying warm had become the primary occupation of everyone at Clearwater. He came back with a different coat and the same quiet, and he sat at the end of the long table and said, "Thank you," when she brought his plate, and she said, "You're welcome," and they were exactly where they'd been before. Except that this time he brought a small parcel to the kitchen door. She was kneading bread at 6 in the morning, and he knocked on the door frame again, hat in hand, and held out a paper-wrapped package the size of a thick book. "I don't know if it's useful," he said. "I was in Calgary." She took it from him, because it seemed rude not to. She unwrapped one corner, carefully, and found good quality dried fruit, the dark kind, for baking. Not cheap. Considerably more than you'd think to bring as a casual offering. She did not know what to say. Nobody brought her things. Nobody brought her anything. She was the one who did the bringing. "Thank you, Mr. Holt," she said. "This is very kind." He was already looking at the door frame. "The bread at the hotel in Calgary was terrible," he said, which was not, strictly speaking, a response to what she'd said, but she understood it to mean something that she filed away carefully and thought about later. The trouble, when it came, arrived in the shape of a man named Mr. Prescott, who was a cousin of one of the regular drovers and who'd been drinking since noon. Isobel had not been paying him much attention. She'd learned early to minimize her attention to men like that, because attention, even the careful avoidance kind, sometimes made things worse. But he was at the near table when she passed with a tray, and he said something to the man beside him that made the other man laugh. A hard, short laugh, the kind that comes at someone's expense, and she caught her own name in it and kept walking. She kept her face entirely neutral. She'd had practice, but the kitchen door hadn't closed behind her before she heard the chair scrape back at the far end of the room. She stood at the work table and listened to the particular quality of the silence that followed. It was not the same silence as before. It had weight to it. She did not go back out to see what was happening. Later, Mrs. Drummond came to the kitchen with an expression that managed to be simultaneously disapproving and satisfied. "Mr. Prescott has decided to eat his supper in his room," she said. "I hope he's comfortable," Isobel said, which was the safest possible response. Mrs. Drummond said, in the way that meant she was not going to explain further. She picked up a dish and began drying it. "Mr. Holt asked after your family earlier," she added after a moment. Isobel's hands stilled for a fraction of a second. "I haven't any, so I told him." Mrs. Drummond set down the dish. He seemed sorry to hear it. She picked up another dish. "He's a quiet man," she said, in a tone that was almost considering. "But he listens well." Isobel thought about the folded paper in his coat pocket and the careful way he'd looked at the list and said nothing about any of it. "Yes," she said, "he does." The snow came properly in January and stayed. Life contracted, the way it does in Canadian winters, to a series of small warm circles. The kitchen, the dining room, the supply room. The men who came through Clearwater in winter were generally in more need of warmth than a hot meal, and less inclined to cause difficulty, which suited Isobel. She worked. She made bread every morning. She kept her corner of the kitchen the way she liked it, orderly, practical, without unnecessary ornament. Callum Holt's ranch. She had pieced this together from various fragments of overheard conversation, because no one had told her directly. Was 40 minutes southeast of Clearwater by horse, which meant it was not convenient to come into the station house regularly, and yet he came in most weeks. He said it was for supplies. It probably was, partly. The station house was the nearest thing to a trading post for a considerable distance. He helped when he was there, not in a showy way. He fixed a hinge on the back gate that had been stiff since September. He brought in wood without being asked. Once, on a morning when one of the kitchen boys had not come in, and the breakfast crowd was larger than usual, and Isobel was moving faster than was quite manageable, he appeared at the kitchen door and said, simply, "What's needed?" She'd handed him a stack of plates without thinking. He'd taken them out front without a word. Mrs. Drummond watched all of this. She watched it the way a woman who has seen a great many things watches a thing that is new and not entirely uninteresting. She didn't say anything to Isobel about it, which was unusually restrained of her. In February, Isobel slipped on the ice behind the station house and twisted her ankle. It was not serious. She'd done worse. She sat down in the snow for a moment, took stock of the damage, decided she could still walk on it, and got up again. She was back in the kitchen before anyone had noticed she'd gone, except that the next morning, when she came out to start the breakfast, there was a wooden step-board where there hadn't been one before. A wide, flat piece of pine laid over the worst of the icy patch behind the door, with sand scattered over the top of it. Nailed down, solid. She stood and looked at it for a moment, in the thin early light. She had not told anyone she'd fallen. She had certainly not told Callum Holt. She went inside and made the bread. She did not bring it up. She did not want to embarrass him, and she recognized by now that he would be embarrassed by acknowledgement the same way she would, not from false modesty, but from a genuine discomfort with being seen doing a thing he'd preferred to do quietly. So she said nothing, but the next time he came to the kitchen door, she had set aside the heel of the new loaf, the best part, the crustiest, the one that baked up the richest, and she put it on a plate beside his coffee without a word. He looked at it for a moment. Then he sat down at the kitchen table, which he had not done before, and ate it. She went on with her work. He didn't leave immediately. He stayed another quarter hour, drinking his coffee slowly, not talking. She didn't need him to talk. It was not that kind of quiet. It was an understanding. Spring came reluctantly, the way it does in Alberta, one warm week followed by a cold snap, the ground making up its mind over the course of 6 weeks. By April, the mud season was in full progress, and the roads were difficult, and everyone was vaguely irritable and ready for May. Callum Holt came in on a Tuesday morning and sat down at the long table and ate his breakfast, and then came to the kitchen door and stood there in his usual way. "Miss Crane," he said. She was washing up Mr. Holt. A pause. She had learned to wait through his pauses, because he used them not as an absence of communication, but as a kind of slow gathering of what needed to be said. "I wanted to ask," he said, "whether you were, if the position here, that is to say." He stopped, looked at his hat. "If you were content here," he said, finally. She turned to look at him properly. He was looking at the doorframe again. "It's good work," she said carefully. "Yes," he said, "but I wondered." Another pause. "The Clearwater position doesn't." Mrs. Drummond's a fair woman, but the works, I mean to say. He seemed to be having some difficulty with the sentence. My place. There's no one cooking there. I eat badly. He said this last thing as though it were a practical observation about an agricultural problem. I have the room. The wages would be. He named a figure that was more than she made at Clearwater. I know it's a long way from anywhere, but you'd have the kitchen to yourself. He paused. The kitchen's a good one. Isobel looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen's a good one, she repeated. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. Better than this one, he said. Bigger stove. She wiped her hands on her apron. She thought about the carpetbag she'd arrived with, and the letter from Reverend Morley. She thought about her mother's kitchen, and the flour on their arms, and the sound of the fire. She thought about the wooden stepboard and the dried fruit wrapped in brown paper. I'd want to see it first, she said. That's fair, he said immediately. And speak to Mrs. Drummond properly, of course, and I'd need a week's notice if things didn't work out. A month, he said. I'd give you a month. She looked at him. He looked at the doorframe. All right, she said. The ranch was called Holt's Creek. Though there was no sign saying so, that was just what people in the area called it, which she learned from the post rider. It sat on a gentle slope, looking out over a wide plain that in late April had the tentative, uncertain green of a place that had been very cold for a long time, and was not yet sure it was allowed to thaw. The house was not large, but it was solid. The kitchen was, as he'd said, a good one. Wide plank floors, a serious iron stove, a window over the work table that looked south and caught the morning light. There was a pantry with actual shelving. There was a bread bowl that had been used hard and put away carefully and was exactly the right size. She stood in that kitchen for a moment, just standing. He waited in the doorway. All right, she said again. Good, he said. She had been at Holt's Creek for 3 weeks before she understood that Callum Holt had not told her everything. She'd found the crate in the back room, by accident, looking for an extra lamp chimney, boxes of books, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. Not for reading. Not the kind of books you read, the kind of books you meant to read. Someday, when you'd worked out the finer points of how letters went together into words, and words into meaning. She stood in the back room for a moment. She thought about a lot of things. Then she went back to the kitchen and made supper. She did not mention the books. 3 days later, she left a thin reader on the kitchen table. Her own, carried in the carpetbag since Red Deer, a child's primer that had belonged to her younger brother before he died, and that she'd held on to for reasons she had never entirely articulated to herself. She left it there and went out to bring in the laundry. When she came back, it was sitting open on the table. He was at the far end of the room, looking out the window with the particular studied casualness of a man pretending he has not just been caught in the middle of something. She set down the laundry. She opened the stove. She said, without looking at him, "My mother used to say, start with the words you already know how they sound. Use those to figure out the ones you don't." A long silence. That's a sensible method, he said. She was a sensible woman. She put the kettle on. He stayed at the window for a while longer, then went back to whatever he'd been doing. She made supper. They ate across from each other at the kitchen table, which had become the shape of evenings here. Not something that had been decided, exactly, just something that had settled into the ordinary course of things, the way habits do when nobody has thought to object to them. He was a quick study, as it turned out, not surprising when she thought about it. He was a man who'd learned to do difficult things alone in difficult conditions, which required a certain quality of attention that most people never had reason to develop. He was precise about the things he understood, and honest about the things he didn't. which is rarer than it sounds. By June, he was reading the weekly paper without the primer. He didn't make a fuss about this. He just read it. She didn't make a fuss either. She noticed, and she thought something she didn't put into words, and she got on with her bread. The bread by now had diversified. There was brown bread on Mondays and Wednesdays and Saturdays. There was a white loaf on Sundays. There was occasionally a sweet loaf with dried fruit when she felt like making it. She made it more often than she used to. She didn't examine that too closely. He noticed. He did not say anything specific, but she caught him once, in the early afternoon, cutting himself a piece of the sweet loaf before supper, which was not something he would have done before. He had the look of a man who thinks nobody is watching. She was watching. She looked away in time. In July, a woman came by from the neighboring property, Mrs. Ingrid Venable, who ran a cattle operation with her 2 sons. Her husband had died, and who appeared to know approximately everyone within a 50-mile radius and had opinions about most of them. She arrived without warning and stayed for 2 hours and drank 3 cups of tea, and in the course of this managed to communicate with the practiced indirectness of a woman who knows exactly what she's doing, that Callum Holt had lived alone on that land for 11 years and had been considered a lost cause by the available women of the district for approximately 9 of those years. Isobel received this information quietly, over the teacups, while Mrs. Venable talked about something else entirely. After the woman left, she stood in the kitchen for a while, not making anything, which was unusual. He came in from the south field and saw her standing there. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Mrs. Venable," she said, "talks a great deal." "Yes," he said, "she does." She looked at him. He looked back at her, which was also something that had been gradually becoming more frequent. The direct looking, where before there had been mostly the studied attention to door frames and middle distances. She said, "She seems to believe I'm a puzzle to you," he said, after a suitable pause. "I won't speak for Mrs. Venable. What would you speak for?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the window. "You came here," he said slowly, "and you made a place for yourself in the kitchen, and you didn't make a fuss about things, and you didn't expect anything from anybody, and you kept on just being yourself." He paused again. "I expect that's not as common as it sounds." Isobel considered this. "You fixed my step," she said. "It was a liability," he said, "from a practical standpoint, and the dried fruit." A pause. "Calgary has a good dry goods store, and the bread bowl." She hadn't mentioned the bread bowl. It had been new when she'd arrived, clearly purchased recently. She'd been waiting to see if he'd bring it up. He hadn't until now. "I thought," he said, "that a woman who bakes that way, you'd want the right bowl." He was looking at the window again. It seemed like the sort of thing that would matter. Isobel stood very still for a moment. Then she said, with great care, "It did matter." He turned from the window and looked at her directly. This had been building for a long time, the looking, and they both knew it. And neither of them had been in any particular hurry. The way people who are not certain they deserve something tend to move toward it slowly, just in case. But they were looking at each other now, plainly, without the door frames in the way. "I'm glad," he said. The summer moved through its weeks the way Alberta summers do, enormous blue skies, the warm smell of grass, evenings that stayed light until you were too tired to appreciate them. She wrote to Reverend Morley in Lethbridge. She didn't have much to say, except that she had found good work in a good place, and was well. She thanked him for the letter of introduction, which had gotten her to Clearwater, which had gotten her here. She thought about mentioning Holt and decided the letter would cover it well enough without any additions. He had a habit, by September, of reading in the evenings in the kitchen. while she did her last bits of preparation for the next morning. Setting out the flour, covering the bowl, checking the stove. He read with his reading glasses on, which she'd found for him in a box in the back room, and which he wore with the slightly self-conscious air of a man who is 50% grateful and 50% uncertain about them. She'd told him once that they suited him. He'd said he didn't know about that. She'd said she did. The reading glasses had become a permanent fixture. On a Friday evening in September, he lowered the paper and said, without preamble, "I'd like to ask you something, and you don't have to answer it in a work capacity." She looked up from the flour bowl. "Not about the ranch," he said, which was his way of saying personal, since personal was a word he'd never quite gotten comfortable using directly. "All right," she said. He put the paper down and looked at his reading glasses in his hand. "I'd like," he tried again. "What I'm asking is if you'd be willing, that is to say." He stopped. She waited. He said, very plainly, without ornamentation, "I don't want you to leave here, Isobel. And I know that's a selfish thing to say, but I'd like to make it so you wouldn't have to." He paused. "If you were willing." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at his hands, holding the reading glasses. She thought about being 24 years old on a Thursday mail coach with a carpetbag and a letter from a minister. She thought about her mother's kitchen, the flour, the fire. She thought about how you could lose everything and still carry the most important parts of yourself through to wherever you ended up. She thought about a bread bowl, bought new by a man who understood that a woman who bakes that way would want the right one. "I'm willing," she said. He looked up at her. "I'd like it," she said, "to stay." He put the reading glasses on the table with the careful deliberateness of a man trying not to let on how much something has moved him. "Good," he said, and then, after a moment, "Yes, good." She smiled. It was not a dramatic smile. It did not transform her face into something extraordinary. It was just the smile of a woman who has found, after a considerable search, the exact right place for herself. She went back to covering the bread bowl. He picked up his paper. The kitchen was warm and quiet and exactly what it was. Not a remarkable place. Just a place where two people who were not accustomed to being seen had, slowly and without any particular ceremony, begun to see each other clearly. The next spring, when the catalogs came in the mail, and she was looking through one of them for seeds, she found herself lingering over the page for school supplies, the primers and practice slates, and small thick pencils for small uncertain hands. She thought about her brother's reader, which was still on the kitchen shelf between the almanac and the jar of dried lavender she'd put there in August. She thought about the years Callum had spent moving carefully around words on a page, doing it alone in the way that people carry their private difficulties when they've had to. She thought about the women who might be right now sitting on a mail coach with a letter of introduction and everything they owned in a bag not much larger than a pillowcase. She ordered the catalogued supplies. When they arrived, she set up one of the back rooms with a table and 2 chairs and pinned a small card to the door that said, in her careful handwriting, "Reading, Tuesday and Thursday mornings. All welcome." Callum found it when he came in from the morning's work. He stood in the hallway and read the card. He didn't say anything for a moment. She watched him from the kitchen doorway. Then he said, "All welcome. All welcome," she confirmed. He looked at the card a moment longer. Then he came into the kitchen and sat down, and she put his coffee in front of him and the heel of the new loaf, the crustiest part, the best part, and they sat together in the warm kitchen while the bread cooled and the Alberta spring came in through the open window, cautious and unhurried, bringing with it the smell of grass and the long pale light of a morning that was going to be fine.